As time goes on, the more I come to appreciate older video games. Everyone has their favorite games to some of the classic Nintendo systems, such as NES, Nintendo 64, and the GameCube. I find it hard to believe that the GameCube is already 4 generations old. When talking about the Nintendo 64, most people bring up the same few suspects: Ocarina of Time, GoldenEye, Super Mario 64, Banjo Kazooie, Pokemon Snap, so many good games. It's no surprise that these games are favored by many. They're all really fun and change the way games are created today. There's a certain game that is special to me that has received poor ratings in recent years. While I agree with some comments, I would like to defend Donkey Kong 64 for what it is by comparing it to similar games like Mario 64 and Banjo Kazooie. But first, let's talk about the Donkey Kong series. One common mistake that many players make is comparing this game to Donkey Kong Country. I can understand why, since this was the first 3D platform game of the series. It makes sense to compare this with the rest of the Donkey Kong series, but people are expecting it to be like Donkey Kong Country. But this also applies to Super Mario 64. It was the first 3D platform Mario game, but it's very different from the previous 2D Mario games. See, Donkey Kong 64 isn't Donkey Kong Country, and I believe Rare wanted to try something different with a new 3D world. Moving on to comparing this game to Super Mario 64, let's talk about one obvious problem: the camera. Yes, the camera is difficult to manage in this game, but guess what? It sucks in this game too. But it doesn't end there. Controlling the characters is frustrating in both games. It's uncomfortable and floaty, and I feel like I never quite go where I want to unless I tiptoe from point A to point B. I have never felt the same level of stress and anger than when I tried jumping from one platform to another and flat out missing it. But again, this applies to both games. After watching the Game Grumps play Mario 64, you can clearly hear Aaron's hate for the game progress over time.
Oh god! Oh god!
Okay.
No!
Okay.
Alright, fuck this level.
Okay, Aaron,
fuck this game! That's how good I am. Oh god, no! No! I hate this game. I'm not afraid to say it. Fuck this game. Fuck this game. Ah! It's impossible because the fucking controls in this ass game are ass as shit. This fucking ass game fucking sucks.
Hey, you did it. You did it.
I fucking hate it. Oh, God!
Wow.
I hate it!
Wow.
Dan, I hate it!
But maybe we shouldn't be blaming the games as much, because the poor controller design is certainly a factor to consider. I say it with love, of course. Both Donkey Kong 64 and Super Mario 64 allow the characters to occasionally fly. And just as mentioned before, the poor camera and rough controls make this part of the game very painful. Because these games are older, we had much more limitations. Both these games will experience frame rate issues and glitches. It pains me to say this, but even Super Mario Sunshine had problems dealing with frame rate a whole generation later. The game also has camera and control issues, but that's for another day. Here are a few things I think Donkey Kong 64 does better than Super Mario 64. I find it frustrating and unnecessary how every time you collect a star, the game sends you out of the world. This means the player is constantly jumping right back into the world to continue collecting stars. Whereas with Donkey Kong 64, you continue playing where you left off once you've collected the golden banana. The Mario series has continued this trend for so many other games. Sunshine, Galaxy, maybe Odyssey will break this trend. We'll certainly find out very soon. I'm assuming there is at least one person making a counterpoint, saying that the specific golden bananas for each of the 5 Kongs is the equivalent to exiting a world in Mario 64. And while I see why this is annoying, at least the game gives you multiple tag barrels throughout the world for you to quickly switch characters. I also don't totally care for how Mario 64 gives you hints on how to collect each star. This isn't a deal breaker situation for me, but I like how most of the golden bananas are found upon exploring the game rather than the game telling you how to collect them. To be fair, a lot of these stars would be very difficult to find without hints, so perhaps it's best to keep that, or just ignore them for an even better challenge. To wrap this segment up, these two games dealt with brand new challenges that come with game design. We, the players, have gotten so used to 2D worlds that we're quick to criticize the first few 3D games. Look at Ocarina of Time, a fantastic, beautiful game, but has many flaws. But we needed these games to experiment with the 3D world so that we can have the games that we have today and the games that will come in the future. Super Mario 64 came out in 1996, while Donkey Kong 64 came out in 1999. There's no surprise that Super Mario 64 is any better than DK64, but neither games have aged very well. Comparing Donkey Kong 64 to Banjo Kazooie is going to be very interesting because the two games are very similar. Starting with some more positive comparisons, these games were both made by Rare, and the music was composed by Grant Kirkhope. Some of the music in DK64 is actually unused music made for Banjo. Banjo Kazooie came out in 1998, a little over a year before DK64. As for the games themselves, Banjo Kazooie has a frustrating camera with poor controls just like DK64. One big complaint I hear the most is that Donkey Kong 64 is a backtracking game, where you spend a large amount of time collecting items. And even though I would agree with that, how is Banjo Kazooie any different? I suppose the complaint applies more to Donkey Kong because you have to collect items for 5 different characters instead of the one. I realize I will be very biased when I say this, but I couldn't care less for the majority of the collectibles in Banjo. To me, there's something much more satisfying in collecting bananas throughout the game rather than collecting jigsaw puzzle pieces in different colored jingos. It especially feels satisfying to reach the full 101% completion. Another function to comparing these two games are the characters' movesets. I grew up playing a lot of Donkey Kong 64, so their moveset is second nature to me. But when playing Banjo Kazooie for the first time, I immediately recognize a lot of familiar movesets. Ultimately, it feels like I'm playing the same game. It's not even something that bothers me. I just find it interesting how the two games have the player maneuver around each level similarly, yet one game gets more praise than the other. Moving on to what I think Donkey Kong 64 does better, I believe it has better swimming mechanics. Banjo Kazooie, hands down, has some of the worst swimming mechanics out there. Not only is it difficult to move around while wrestling with the camera, but the player has to stress over underwater limitations. Yes, Super Mario 64 has a limit as well, but it is significantly easier to handle. See, with Banjo, the only way you can stay underwater longer is by collecting air bubbles. Collecting that underwater Jingo was by far more frustrating than any Beaver Bother level. If you're going to limit the amount of time a player can spend underwater, at least make it easy to replenish your health like in Mario 64. Or, better yet, do it the way Donkey Kong 64 did it. No limits at all. You can stay underwater as long as you like. And on top of that, the controls are a bit easier to manage, unlike Banjo. Not by much, mind you, for it is the Nintendo 64 after all. Something in Banjo Kazooie that I find to be ridiculous is that Banjo can't even grab onto a ledge. I couldn't believe it at first and thought I was doing it wrong. I tried to do it over and over and learned that it's just not possible. It's just a simple concept that they didn't include in the game. And no, it's not the end of the world, but last second ledge grabbings have saved me multiple times in Mario 64 and DK64. Finally, I prefer the plot to Donkey Kong 64 a little over Banjo Kazooie. Maybe I just like the characters more in Donkey Kong, but I don't personally care about Banjo's sister getting abducted by Gruntilda. The plot for Donkey Kong is far more interesting to me. It's not just King K. Rool taking all the bananas, he's taken the other Kongs and he's aimed a freaking laser at their home. I realize I'm being biased again, but that's just how I feel. I'd like to wrap up this segment by referencing a video by Freezax. I hope I'm saying that right. I won't go into much detail on their Banjo-Kazooie vs. Donkey Kong 64 video, for it's 25 minutes long, but I'll leave the link in the description for you to watch. It's definitely worth checking out. At one point in their video, they explain how some games are linear, like Banjo-Kazooie, and others are non-linear, Legend of Zelda. Neither are good or bad, but it depends on how the game works with it. Donkey Kong 64 can be seen as a non-linear game because of the amount of backtracking there is. But many Zelda games call for a good amount of backtracking and revisiting certain areas, yet I don't hear much complaining about that. So what makes backtracking in Donkey Kong 64 so wrong? Before wrapping up this video, I would like to bring up some attention to the positive aspects of the game. There's a large overworld, followed by big, colorful worlds with plenty of little things to do. Like with Banjo-Kazooie, I like how you can upgrade the character movesets to something greater. I feel that the game offers a lot of playtime and replay value. Although the backtracking is frustrating to some, I love and appreciate having a variety of different characters to play from. It reminds me of games like Super Smash Bros. Or Overwatch. Each character is different from each other and special. I also love the personality of each playable character, as well as the enemies, and it's very rewarding reaching that full 101% completion rate. I could go on even more about some of the petty comments I've seen, like how the music is boring or copying Banjo-Kazooie, which, as we discussed, same composer, even recycling some old music. So, you know. Or even the name alone, Donkey Kong 64, being non-creative, to which I say, right. Instead of me nitpicking at every other little thing about this game, feel free to check out Snowman Gaming's video called Bad Game Design, Donkey Kong 64. I feel like he makes a lot of great points while offering a ton of solutions. Similar to Eagle Raptor criticizing Ocarina of Time out of love, Snowman does the same. I'm well aware of this game's flaws and admit it isn't perfect. But is it bad? No. Is it a masterpiece? Certainly not. But the same goes to these two games. So if we're going to make criticism toward this game that also applies to these two, we might as well be fair, level the playing field, and admit the flaws in these higher praised games. But hey, these are just my opinions. I love this game, and I always will. But what do you think of all of this? You still hate it, or do you like it? What about Super Mario 64 or Banjo Kazooie? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time.